the Basic of Crisis Management. By the end of this chapter, the students will be able to obtain an overview of the linguistic development of the term crisis, to be able to understand the scientific discussion on the crisis phenomenon, to be in the position to define crisis and to disassociate it from various other terms, to learn the system and activity of crisis management in tourism, to understand the role of mass media for information dissemination as well as influencing the recipient's opinion, to name the dissemination influence variables. The word crisis comes from the Greek krisis, which means differentiation or decision. Within the legal sphere, the term was used to describe the differentiation between just and unjust, whilst, in theology, it described the separation of salvation and damnation. Medical terminology used the expression for the break in a development that had previously been continuous. In the 16th century, with the revival of classic medicine, the word became part of everyday language. The use of the term crisis became evident in all areas of politics, society, and the economy, and, by the mid-19th century, people were already complaining about its overuse. Various scientific findings can be classed as either referring to persons/institutions or as contributions to the individual/collective model depending on their focal points. As a rule, the human being is the focal point of considerations concerning individual models. In this case, the individual experiences the crisis as an intensification of the actual situation, which, in extreme cases, can lead to his or her end. Crisis is understood as a dangerous and extraordinary situation in which a decision must be made under time pressure. A crisis is an undesired, extraordinary, often unexpected, and timely limited process with ambivalent development possibilities. It demands immediate decisions and countermeasures in order to influence the further development again positively for the organization, destination, and to limit the negative consequences as much as possible. A crisis situation is determined by evaluating the seriousness of the occurring negative events, which threaten, weaken or destroy competitive advantages or important goals of the organization. National economics was the first to look into crises. The approaches understood crises predominantly as cyclical economic problems. Business administration only started to take an interest later, and this was prompted by the conditions that accompanied the crude oil shortage of the 1970s. The limitations that were, until then, unknown and the ever more frequent insolvency of companies prompted an economic investigation, the consequence of which was the emphasis on coping with crises. The term crisis should be disassociated from various other terms that are also connected with negative events or are used instead of it, in order to ensure its standard use within the framework of the rest of this book. Catastrophes are negative events, which, in contrast to crisis, have a clear inevitable outcome. Consequently, the catastrophe is missing the crisis ambivalence towards development opportunities. A connection or a simultaneous occurrence of a catastrophe and a crisis can be found especially in tourism, where catastrophes that occur in the environmental sphere trigger a crisis for the affected organization. Turnaround is understood as countermeasures used when an organization falls short of its goals. These activities, which concentrate, in part, on an acute crisis, aim for an abrupt reversal of the development. Thus, they concentrate on a particular part of the crisis, the object of which is coping with the crisis. Turnaround, consequently, portrays a special case within crisis management. Structural changes are changes in the economic structure and take place in economies on a regular basis. They are not to be traced back on seasonal or cyclical influences but are a consequence of, for example, changing demand structures, technological progress, discovery of new products, raw materials, or production technologies. From the viewpoint of a destination or a company, those changes of a so far continuous development, i.e. the structural changes, require a process of adaptation. If this necessity of changes is not identified or handled in good time, the organization is more prone to crisis. Generally seen, the management of structural changes normally belongs, because of its principally long-term development, to the sphere of normal management activities. Conflict, clashes between personal groupings, which can take place inside or outside the company, are described as conflicts. In contrast to crisis, conflicts can be of an unlimited duration and can even be desired. Thus, they must not necessarily have negative consequences. It is, however, possible that conflicts are the cause of a crisis. It has already been shown that crises go through a development process. This leads to a phased subdivision of the crisis process becoming practice. As a rule, it is possible to differentiate between 2 to 4 phases of a crisis. The presently predominant 3-phase crisis process is used as a basis in this book. Using time pressure as a characteristic, this divides the phases of a crisis into potential, latent, and acute crises. Potential crises are characterizing a phase in which the crisis is only an imaginary construct. They are, as such, neither ascertainable nor existent, for which reason this situation is described by Christek as the quasi-normal condition of the company in which it constantly finds itself. Latent crises describe the phase in which the crisis has already broken out but is not yet identifiable with the normal quantitative instruments available to the company. Countermeasures in this phase are not yet subject to noticeable restrictions. The phase of an acute crisis is the period of time in which the destructive effect of the crisis is perceived and the company strives to cope. The symptoms apparent in the acute crisis phase, which should not, however, be confused with the causes, are, as a rule, recognized as an indication of crisis within a company. The perception of a crisis situation is revealed by means of company reporting. The use of the term event is in fact more appropriate since it is generally defined as a particular extraordinary occurrence. If this particular, extraordinary occurrence causes negative consequences, this could be termed as a negative event. An analysis of events that would not cause lasting damage falls under the area of normal management and is covered by risk management. Negative events will be defined as all incidents pertaining to the organization's environment, which can cause lasting damage from the perspective of the concerned organization. This means that they can threaten, weaken, or destroy competitive advantages or important goals of the organization. Thus, it is preferable to aim at a wide point of view, which considers negative events not only as security problems. This selection of crises in tourism was aimed at highlighting those particular events, which have been forgotten outside the region. They show that many of the events which make us concerned, afraid or shocked have already happened in the past. Often, negative events appear only in slightly changed formats or in different circumstances. However, they tend to repeat in their basic form. The term management usually describes the leadership of an organizational unit. It is possible to differentiate between an institutional and a functional way of thinking. With regard to the former, management is a description of those groups of people who carry out management tasks, their activities, and functions. As far as functional thinking is concerned, management is a term for all tasks and processes connected with the running of a working organization. In particular, these are planning, organization, implementation, and control. The functional perspective of management can be extended to include a person or material-related consideration. The first use of the term crisis management is normally attributed to the political sphere. Accordingly, it is said that U.S. President J.F. Kennedy used the expression during the Cuban crisis of 1962 to describe the handling of a serious, extraordinary situation. The term crisis management must be disassociated from risk management. The latter is focusing also on those events, which for the organization or destination are not causing serious or lasting damage. However, After risk management was originally limited to risks which were insurable, a steady tendency can be observed which intends to cover with risk management all different kinds of risks. Crisis management as a function refers to changes of tasks and processes when a crisis occurs. Different types of crisis management and corresponding activities are distinguished with regard to the process character of the crisis and the differentiation between its various phases.